What happens when survival mode becomes your norm? In a recent meeting, I was working with a client who was on the verge of breaking down. They told me, I don't know how long I can keep doing this. In their situation, they were responsible for helping people who didn't make it easy on them. Unexpected things kept coming up, and they felt like they always had to be available. It was wearing them out mentally and emotionally. They thought helping these people was the problem. So we started looking at what was actually happening. I had them walk me through their week. We looked at their calendar. And the interesting thing that I found was their calendar wasn't full. There was actually a lot of open time, but it didn't feel open to them. So we needed to find out why they felt so overwhelmed. As we kept talking, they shared how they were feeling. And they said, I'm always waiting for the shoe to drop. Even when nothing was directly happening, they were expecting something to go wrong that they would have to deal with. And I described it as having the unresolved situation spinning above their head. They weren't even in the situation anymore, but it was still affecting them wherever they went. So their calendar wasn't full, but their mind was. And they carried everything in their head 24/7. They weren't only thinking about what they actually had to do, they were thinking about what might happen, what somebody else might need, or what could go wrong, what they'd have to do if something happened. What was actually happening got mixed together with what they were anticipating might happen. And so we needed to separate those two things, and I helped them evaluate what was actually happening and what they were worried might happen. Because they are two different things. They weren't really enjoying this open time that I could see on their calendar. They felt like they were in kind of a limbo because they avoided trying to make plans or getting into something because they might have to stop. And they didn't feel like they could really make plans because something might happen. So even when they weren't dealing with the problem directly, the perceived problem that might happen was still affecting them. There's actually research that helps explain what happens when we have unfinished goals, when we're trying to focus on something else. I call it the daunting unfinished. Making a specific plan for dealing with an unfinished task can reduce these intrusive thoughts. Planned rather than actual progress was sufficient enough to eliminate the goal-related intrusions. In other words, they didn't necessarily have to finish it, they just needed to plan for it. And that became an important part of what I was talking to my client about because we had to decide something before it happened. There were things this client couldn't control. They couldn't control when the next problem was going to happen, but they could decide ahead of time what they could do if it did. So we started to explore scenarios, and I helped them ask, does this actually require me to be there? Does it need to be handled right now? Could somebody else handle it for me? And I encouraged them to start to utilize the Eisenhower box, which is an organizational tool to help them determine whether something was urgent or important so they could begin to prioritize and set boundaries. There also is a difference between being responsible for making sure something gets handled and having to personally handle it. And being a good delegator can also help relieve some of that pressure. They were living as though something was going to happen all the time and that they would have to deal with it when it did. But that wasn't always true. There were other options they didn't see. So they started talking about what could be in place beforehand. Now they didn't have to waste any more mental or emotional energy wondering what they would do when the next problem happened, because some of those decisions could already be made. They already had a boundary in a different area. And we looked at their schedule and I noticed something else. There were certain commitments they protected with healthy boundaries. They made those commitments so they weren't available for something else, and they communicated that well when those other people tried to get them to do things. I showed them that they were already implementing boundaries in another area. So they already knew how to do it. but they weren't doing the same thing with the rest of their time when certain people were involved. And I told them, we teach people how to treat us. At least that's what Dr. Phil says. They were leaving time open in case somebody needed them. And I told them, you leaving it open for them, that's a decision you made. And they realized that was true. And they also realized they weren't setting a boundary. There's a saying that someone once told me, poor planning on your part does not constitute an emergency on mine. They couldn't control whether somebody else needed something, but they certainly could decide whether every requirement of them would change what they were doing in the moment. And that was something they hadn't really considered. It was creating some resentment, because when something happened, it kind of immediately triggered a negative reaction. Here we go again, now I have to deal with this. As if they were a victim to the circumstance, and they didn't realize they were choosing it. But when we took a little bit of time and looked at what they thought they had to do, we discovered that at times they did have to deal with it. But most of the time, they didn't. So if they continually did things they didn't want to do without establishing clear boundaries, that's why they would become resentful. And that resentment started building toward those people they were trying to help. That doesn't mean the other person's needs weren't real. It just means that their needs and my client's response to their needs were two different things. Something else contributed to the frustration. They expected those people to do things a particular way. They had asked them to do things a certain way, and for some reason, they just never did it. It just wasn't happening. So I said, we need to stop expecting people to do something they've already demonstrated they're not capable of doing. Because now we're creating our own frustration. What's that saying? If you keep doing the same thing and expecting a different result, that's insanity. So it's time to try something new. In other words, if they explain this over and over to the people and they never changed, they need to stop assuming that explaining it again is going to solve the problem. So instead of asking, how do I get them to do this? We started asking, what can we put in place that doesn't depend on them doing it? And now we had something we could actually work with. What was actually wearing them out, if you remember where we started, was they said to me, I don't know how long I can keep doing this. They thought the problem was the people and the situations that they were dealing with. And those situations were difficult, but their calendar wasn't full. The situation wasn't actually happening all the time, but they were living with it in their head as if it was. And they kept everything there, waiting for the next problem to happen. They were hesitant to make plans, leaving their time open because something might happen, and they were assuming they would have to deal with another thing. They weren't attending to the things they needed to or wanted to do because of it. They were unintentionally expecting those other people to do things they weren't capable of doing. So even when they had time to themselves, they weren't fully present to do something that they wanted, because their mind was distracted by this. And they were feeling that daunting unfinished that we were talking about. And that was wearing them out. There are things in life that we cannot control, but there's a difference between dealing with something when it happens and living like it's happening all the time. Sometimes we need to get everything out of our head so we can process what's actually happening and respond appropriately. Then we can make decisions beforehand so we're better prepared when the next problem comes. And this includes putting those boundaries where they're needed, based on what's actually happening and what it actually requires of us. And delegating when something doesn't require our time personally. And most importantly, we need to stop expecting people to do things they've already shown they aren't capable of doing. Because even though circumstances may not immediately change, we don't have to be burdened by them in other areas of life. Instead, we can deal with them when they actually happen without living in anticipation of them happening.